Our first session this afternoon is Left Behind or Lifted Up? Navigating workforce transitions in the AI era.
Thanks everyone for being here. I thought I would kick off this discussion with 3 facts that look to be on a bit of a collision course. The first is what's on all of our minds. It's that we're at the beginning of a fundamental transformation in the nature of work, driven by AI and automation. And while the pace and the scale and the shape of that transformation might be up for debate, it's clear that tens of millions of jobs, if not more, are going to change fundamentally in the coming years. They may be destroyed, they may be created, they may just evolve and adapt, but they will change. Fact 2 is that we've already witnessed a transformation of our workforce, but one that I would argue we haven't really reckoned with yet. Fully a third of the US workforce today is over the age of 50. And they are people who need to stay employed for their current economic health, but also for their long-term economic security. And by some projections, 20 million low-wage workers over 50 are in roles that are at high risk of displacement from AI and automation. In fact, older workers are overrepresented in all but one of the fields that are considered at high risk of AI displacement from automation. Those people are in office support, customer service, they're on production lines and doing deliveries, and they're gonna not just need new jobs, they're gonna need new careers. And fact 3 is that those same workers are already far more likely, if they lose a job, to end up in the long-term unemployed. 1 in 10 older worker, low-wage older worker who loses a job, only 1 in 10 will find a job with equal or greater pay. So that paints a pretty bleak picture of our future. But what the future looks like is still up to us. I still believe that. So today we have a terrific panel to explore the choices that are in front of us and the lessons we can learn from past economic transformations to ensure that we make this a moment of opportunity for everyone. Andy, I'm going to start with you. I shared with you when we first spoke that I read your book, Race Against the Machine, when it came out about 15 years ago. And it fundamentally shifted my view of the economy we were walking into. You described how automation was outpacing human skills and could drive increasing inequality. 15 years later, in this moment of AI everything, what's different? And what does this mean for workers, in your view?
So first of all, thanks for having me. And I really want to give credit where credit is due to the organizers of this conference. We all know how hard it is to find some white guy to shoot off his mouth about technology. So, wow, you found one. Claire, to answer your question, what the past 15 years have taught me is humility about predicting the future trajectories of technology. Because when Eric and I wrote Race Against the Machine and then Second Machine Age, I became fairly convinced that jobs like truck driver and radiologist were actually under real pressure because of technology. And I was not alone in this. Jeff Hinton is one of the grandfathers of modern artificial intelligence, said in 2016 or 17, we should stop training radiologists. We're just not going to need them. That was an incorrect prediction. There are more radiologists today than there were when Hinton made that. The number of truck drivers in America has gone up. And so all that has encouraged me to be kind of humble about predicting either massive job losses or gains or saying that I know with any clarity what's happening here. So I'm going to try to back up a step. What I do know is going on is exactly what you said. There is a deep and fundamental technology transformation going on because of AI and all the stuff that we bundle together with that. History is really clear about what happens in previous huge technology transitions. There is disruption. There is absolutely automation. There are jobs that are lost. And there are people freaking out about the future of massive technological unemployment. And what that teaches me is that when creative destruction happens, it is always easier to foresee the creation, the destruction, than the creation. And I worry that in our discourse about AI right now, we're making that mistake all over again. I'm fairly confident that we're going to come through this transition or deepen the amount of AI in our economy, and there are going to be continued opportunities for people at all skill levels. The economy is still going to need human beings and the unique skills that they have. So I have some level of calm. That doesn't mean that the transition is not going to be rocky in some ways, but the history of major tech transitions actually gives me some calm.
That's great. Stephanie, your work at Partnership on AI is really focused on how employers can ethically manage this. That's my understanding of it. You've been on Plant 4 as you're looking at that front line. What gives you hope? What gives you worry?
I think one of the biggest sources of hope in my mind is just the genuine expertise that every worker brings to their role, and that how that knowledge can partner with AI systems, especially the generative AI systems that are increasingly prevalent in workplaces, to achieve better results both for that worker and for that business. I think if we, as employers, as people supporting employers, supporting workers throughout this transition, really focus in on worker voice, worker expertise, and worker knowledge as sort of the North Star that helps us, guide what this transition should look like, helps us choose what systems to purchase, helps us decide how we should use them inside workplaces. I think I would land in Andy's place of optimism of thinking that we're going to come out of this in a pretty good place. Where I start to get worried is I see news stories where that's not what people are doing. They're thinking about, their staff as a cost center, as opposed to thinking about it as a genuine asset and source of expertise within their business. They're overconfident about the amount of data that sits inside their databases and spreadsheets, as opposed to inside their team's heads. And when you get down that path, you start to see decisions like, we're going to lay off X number of workers because we can replace them with AI. I think that's wrong-headed from a business perspective. I think that you are already starting to see in reports from McKinsey and others about how businesses that are taking the sort of emphasis on worker knowledge, emphasis on worker voice path, are seeing better results in AI implementation than those that are just focused on cost-cutting. But if we play into this narrative of what we're trying to do is just replace all workers in the workforce and create a technology that's capable of performing the sum of all economically valuable human activity, that's where I start to get very worried.
Thank you. I'd love to go backwards now. There have been many transitions in the past that net benefited the overall economy, but left specific portions of the economy, specific groups of workers, left them behind. Catherine, you've been studying this since the early 1980s. Talk to us a bit about what we could have done differently, what we should have learned, and how that can inform this moment.
Well, thank you, Claire. I want to share the skepticism about prognostication with my colleagues here. I think one of the lessons we learned from the past is that we had no idea what was going to happen, truly, but we made some educated guesses about ways to try to protect people. So if you go back into the 90s when displaced workers were in the era of NAFTA, it wasn't really technological change that was on the docket. It was trade that was an issue, as it is now. So the programs that were designed then were designed to protect people to some degree from unemployment rising as a consequence of free trade. And the movement of jobs, especially in manufacturing, offshore to China, to Mexico, where wages were massively lower than American wages, leveled many Midwestern towns. There's a lot less focus on the American South, which is where I've just come from today, but it happened there too. Whole towns that were dependent on the textile industry just lost absolutely everything. And along with the loss of those major industries came all the tertiary losses, the dry cleaners, the restaurants, everybody who depended on workers who could spend money was also out of luck. In that NAFTA era, in the Clinton years, they were aware that this was a possible outcome. And to be fair, though, they thought rising incomes elsewhere around the world would generate demand for American products. So they thought this would lead to an export boom in the US. That didn't exactly happen. They also thought that low-skilled parts of the manufacturing industries would be what would offshore, but the high-skilled end would remain here. And we can see that process at work today as parts are manufactured in Canada or Mexico, but design and final assembly tends to be done here in the US. Nonetheless, employment in manufacturing is way down compared to those glory days, and what there is tends to be of this higher skill end, and that is one of the consequences of many forms of technological change. They do lead to unemployment and upskilling at the same time. So what did we do to address that problem? The principal response was the Trade Readjustment Act, and it provided workers that were impacted by NAFTA with funding to support retraining. Critics of that act claimed that all this did was transfer people who were formerly active workers onto another form of income support. It didn't result in reskilling. It didn't lead to replacement employment. It led to surges in disability enrollments, especially since welfare reform at the same time jettisoned AFDC as a social shock absorber, and this is what many older people at the time faced. Advocates of the Trade Readjustment Act pointed to some regional successes in attracting new kinds of employment, though, that were open to retrained employees. But the wages of those jobs tended to be significantly lower than the unionized jobs that they had lost. So what should we have done, you asked? Well, first, we should have thought harder about investing in new technologies that would have actually made domestic manufacturing more competitive. Indeed, that's sort of what happened eventually, because the big three automakers did come back, but they did so with the benefits of automation and a higher skilled labor force to manage that work. If that kind of investment had been undertaken along with internal upskilling, some of that dislocation might have been avoided. Instead, under NAFTA, we enabled job flight, and the majority of the country saw the benefits in the form of cheaper goods, right? We got much cheaper t-shirts and all kinds of things. But geographically concentrated communities like those textile towns in the South lost pretty much everything. Second, I think we should have thought more, ironically, about what the Biden administration came up with, bringing back from the 1930s a kind of industrial policy. We didn't really use industrial policy thinking in the 90s. It was aimed, the Biden administration was aimed at new forms of energy, of strategic goods like chips that we let go to Taiwan, efficient transportation systems like those that cover Europe and China. If we had done that, if we had thought in terms of industrial policy, we might have organized training for displaced workers, but it would have been clear that there was a job at the end of that training and a resulting boost in productivity. Third, for younger displaced workers, we should have encouraged more re-enrollment in higher education, a kind of GI Bill for displaced workers. We didn't go to the mat for that at scale, and we should have done that for older workers too, because as is almost always the case, older workers took the brunt of that pain, both because they were somewhat less eager for retraining, but also because they had the most invested in the communities where they lived. They had families to take care of. It wasn't easy to pull up stakes and move to someplace else where there might have been a job. They are also more expensive, both in terms of healthcare costs and because their experience leads them to seek employment that is more remunerated. So those are just some of the things we should have thought about.
Thank you. Some of how we need to respond has to do with how fast this happens. Andy, you've talked about how generative AI is fundamentally different than other general purpose technologies. Can you elaborate on that?
And again, like my colleagues, I want to lead with
No one
humility.
wants to predict.
I want to lead with, I will predict, but I'm going to do it by caveating everything up front and saying that we're living in very uncertain times and our track record is not great. So bearing all that in mind, the one kind of vague prediction that I have is that the transition of which we are in the early innings right now is going to unfold with relative speed. And what I mean by that is if you look at when we had electrical power that could really run a factory, and then you look at when the majority of American manufacturing was actually electrified, there were 20 or 30 years. It was a long time before electricity, this really powerful technology, showed up in the aggregate manufacturing productivity statistics. I don't think it's going to take 20 or 30 years this time. I honestly don't, because we have the digital infrastructure in place. I can get, any piece of technology, any piece of digital technology I want, almost on demand, right on this device, which we're all carrying around with us. There is an absolute arms race taking place among the AI builders, so the pace of improvement in the technology is going to continue to be very, very rapid. I talk with a lot of large enterprises, and I know what they're investing in this technology, so there's no shortage of investment out there. Maybe the most fundamental thing, though, is that in sharp contrast to most of the other big important technologies that I can think of, this one is weirdly easy to start using. You talk to it. That's it, right? And this gives me a little bit of hope for the subject of our panel, which is the impact of all of this, especially on older workers, because as you pointed out in your opening remarks, these are the folk who have had the hardest time landing a new job, landing a better job when they get displaced by these huge forces of geopolitics and tech progress. I'm not saying everything's going to be dandy this time around, but one thing I know about people my age and older, man, we love to talk. we do it we're experienced talkers. And so I have some hope that, again, we do need to think about how to bring people back into the workforce if and when they get displaced. But the main interface with this bundle of technology is this thing that I'm doing right now, for which I don't need a great deal of specialized training. I think that's an important caveat, and it's an important reason why this transition might happen more quickly.
Right. So let's just assume that it is an explosive growth. Let's assume it moves quickly. Stephanie, your organization spends a lot of time looking at best practices and establishing those. What should employers in this room, employers everywhere, be thinking about in terms of the best practices? And I was also hoping you could elaborate a little bit more, because we're all trying to figure out what's happening. What are opportunity signals and risk signals?
Yeah, absolutely. And this speaks to a piece of work that we released not that long ago, which we call the Guidelines for AI and Shared Prosperity. The basic premise of it is pretty simple. It's focused on making sure that that AI helps create an abundance of good jobs that is distributed such that every worker can access those jobs. Straightforward sentence, obviously very hard to execute, as everybody in this room knows well. And part of what we have inside those guidelines is a set of tests for employers, for product designers, for unions who are trying to figure out, or worker organizations trying to figure out the impact of a technology that might be introduced into their workplace. And it includes a handful of different things where you can't really sort of give, positive or negative points based on the direction that it goes, because of course every single one of these is going to be really multi-layered in terms of its effects. If I introduce a tool that makes a job easier for a manager, it's very possible that makes it harder or reduces the need for an individual contributor, for instance, right? So even within the same tool and the same workplace, you have to sort out lots of different effects that are happening at the same time. But the effects that are important to pay attention to are actually the ones that, if we look to history, are the ones that would have told us how we should be thinking about previous technologies. We should be thinking about whether the technology is something that workers can use in a way that ultimately expands their ability to do new things, do new work, or whether it helps them just perform what they're currently doing more efficiently in an environment where maybe there is an increased demand for that same task. You should be focusing on whether it improves the job quality for the worker. Some of the research I did with frontline workers, the technology that gets put into call centers to help them transcribe calls, they weren't thinking about things like ergonomics. They weren't thinking about repetitive stress injuries and eye strain. But if you talk to the call center workers, that's why they really like the technology. They no longer go home and feel like they can't use their wrists or that they can't focus their eyes because they've been just typing so fast for the length of a 10 or sometimes 12-hour shift. And so looking and being in conversation with your team, with your workers about sort of where those opportunities for improvement are is huge. And also thinking about not just the wage impacts, not just the job displacement impacts, but also the impacts on the quality of the job itself are ways that you can help try and identify some of those risks as well as opportunities. And earlier there was a comment about sort of, what we would call consumer surplus in kind of the economics world. What is this generating in terms for the rest of us? Ideally, what this creates isn't just more of the same. It creates higher quality. It creates more accessibility. It creates access for people who previously weren't able to get to these goods or services or couldn't have afforded them or weren't able to have them present in their own community. But all of that requires deliberate choice and deliberate decision making about how we use these tools and in service of whom. And so thinking about how does this play out, not just with regards to our own workforce, but also broader community impacts is also something that I would say is important to consider when we think about the broader societal effect.
Great, thank you. Catherine, you sit at the top of one of the largest higher education systems in the country. Where do you see opportunities to tap our existing skills infrastructure to help navigate this transition, and where do we need to build?
So I'm going to take that opening to be a little bit parochial and talk about one of the things we do at the University of California, which is one of the largest universities in the country. Every one of our campuses, and there are 10 of them, has a companion extension division. For most of its 100-year history, that extension division has served non-degree mature students. Its certificate programs are directly gauged to what employers are looking for, and the people who enroll in extension are not conventional undergraduate students. They are older workers who are looking for new skills or opportunities to move up in the organizations where they work. There are 300,000 enrollments in that system every year. It is the largest training system of its kind. It does not serve low-educated workers very well. It is really built for people who do have more education, but it's very well adapted to mature workers who are educated. And most of these extension divisions have certificates among many, there are thousands of them, that focus on specialized applications of AI. Now, this wonderful skill-based system is not available to conventional college students yet. It will be coming this fall. That's one of my big projects. But it is a model for older worker training. It does have one key flaw, however, and this is a policy choice. It's not available for financial aid. Financial aid is something we think people need between the ages of 18 and 22. But we really need to think about training and education as a lifelong enterprise where people continue to come back into higher education to upskill and reskill and go back out into the labor force. Employers are spending $19 billion a year right now enabling people to go back to school. So that really helps. But that's not likely to be the unemployed person who needs a new lease on life. That's going to be an incumbent worker who's looking to upskill. Now, what about low-wage workers? You asked about them. And here I'm going to draw on just some observations from a book I published 2 years ago on the impact of tight labor markets on the working poor. When labor markets get very tight, and they have actually been tight for a record period now, employers actually invest very heavily in upskilling their workers because they can't find workers otherwise, and so they have to train them. They can't hold on to them if they don't provide opportunities for moving up in the structure. So the US labor market, when it's very tight, turns into the great training machine. And that is really tells us it's entirely possible to do this. It is possible for employers to serve as a training system in and of themselves. Or you can use a system like ours. While a powerful recession could knock all of this out, there are lots of reasons to believe that that's not likely to happen. We have, I think, durably tight labor markets. We have many fewer children being born, and we've shut off immigration, and those two devices would have otherwise been used to loosen up the labor market. So under certain conditions, low-wage workers are provided with training opportunities too. But we need to be more intentional about it. We could reward it through tax policies that would incentivize that kind of training. And what we need to recognize is upskilling is lifelong. It's not something you do one time.
That's wonderful. Thank you all. I'm going to just build on that for one final comment. I was sitting in a room about 1.5 years ago, and I heard someone say that the lifespan of a skill is now about 5 years. And I thought, my gosh, how can we say that, know that truth, down from 10, 15, 10 years ago, and still think someone over 50 isn't worth training? They've got 3 or 4 lifespans in front of them in terms of the value of those skills. It is such a privilege to be in this room with the individuals in the community that shape our workforce system, they take our education system, and they're doing the hard thinking in this incredibly uncertain time. And I would just implore everyone to consider that third of the workforce that's over 50. I think if we were more intentional about them over the years, we would probably not be where we are in America today. So thinking about low-wage workers specifically, but also older low-wage workers, it's the one segment of the US workforce that has not rebounded since the pandemic in workforce participation. They are as low as the very bottom that they hit during the pandemic. Every other segment has come back. So we need to do more, and it's thrilling to be with all of you and have the opportunity to share that message. Thank you.